Hi everyone. I thought it would be really important for us to go over a tutorial of how to create a survey in the program that is available to you from NIU. For several of you who are doing your research projects, one of the components of that research is performing a survey. So, for those of us at NIU, we have access to a program called Qualtrics. Now, Qualtrics is a program that allows you to put together a survey, deliver it to people, and also to review the content of the feedback that you get from people based on their answers and such. Now, today I'm going to go over the basics of how to set up a Qualtrics survey and get a link that you can send out to people so that they can, well, take your survey. In a future tutorial, I'm going to be talking about how to access the responses that people give to you and sort of how to make sense of some of the results that you might get. So today, let's focus on the basics. So first of all, if you go to niu.edu, you'll see our normal screen here. What you'll want to do is go to this button that says Quick Links. Now, if you click the Quick Link button, and scroll down, you'll see a program called Qualtrics. Go ahead and click that. We're going to wait for it to load here, of course. Now, I have already signed into Qualtrics on many an occasion because of work I do and things like that. So when I go in, it just automatically brings me into Qualtrics. Now, the first time that you all access Qualtrics, you will not come to this screen. Instead, it will give you a box where you can put in your credentials. So that's going to be your ZID and then the password that you usually use for your NIU stuff, your email, your Blackboard, My NIU, etc. Once you put in your password and user ID, you will log in for the first time. And the first time that you log in, you need to create your account. Just follow the prompts on the screen. Of course, I can't show you that part because I already have an account and it will not let me show you the additional steps of that. So go ahead. It's really easy. Honestly, just, put in your credentials. It will ask you something like whether or not you already have an account or not. If you've never signed into Qualtrics before, the answer is no. Click no. Of course, I'm giving you an approximation. The instructions might be slightly different than what I'm telling you, but they should be relatively close. Once you've created your account and walk through the steps that they walk you through, again, it's super quick. You should get to the point where it says something like create a new survey or something along those lines. Once you click that, it should bring you either to this screen or it might automatically bring you to a create a new project screen, which looks something like this. So here, what we're going to do once you get to this point, we're going to create a survey. So I'm going to go to create your own. And if, just so you guys know, if you get to the point where you're like, if it doesn't bring you to the screen right away, you can always close out, go back to My NIU, go back to niu.edu, use that quick links, go back to Qualtrics, and then it should bring you to that home screen that I was on before. Oops, I guess it's going to make me sign in. Interesting. Okay, sorry, I'm just going to do this. So yeah, you can go back to my niu.edu, pick up where we left off. It should bring you to this. I'm going to go ahead and create new project. I want to make a survey. Okay. So then I have this box here where it says untitled project, so I can give my project a title. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to pretend like I'm doing a survey that gauges people's use of a smart device or a smartphone in particular. Now, before I get started on the actual Qualtrics part, I do want to bring up something to you guys that I think is a best practice sort of deal. I actually created and typed up all the questions that I want to put in my survey in a Word document first. So this way I have something to guide me as I'm going through and creating the survey itself. So as we talked about in class, one of the things that you will want to make sure that you're asking are demographics questions. And as I told you guys in class, the reason for this is that a lot of times when you take a survey, you might find that some people that have certain similar demographics or maybe even disparate demographics may answer questions similarly or differently. And sometimes you can take some really interesting takeaways from your data based on, who answered questions in what ways. So you might find that more high-income people have access to smart devices, which of course seems obvious, right? Because they have more money to afford such luxuries, right? But or you might find that people who are lower income might spend more time on Twitter or Snapchat or something. Of course, I don't know that. I'm just saying that in the case of the survey that I'm envisioning here for this example, those are potential things that you might find. Who knows? But that's why you want to ask. So there are certain kind of demographic questions that are pretty standard. The first is gender, male, female, other, prefer not to say. I always, sometimes you'll find a survey only asks male, female, but of course I think you want to make sure that you're inclusive so that way you can get really interesting, like I say, get those interesting data points, right? If you give them another option, I'll show you guys on the survey software how to allow them to input an answer. For age, for this, I assume we're probably going to be talking about teens and up, since we're talking about smart devices. So I started my age at under 16 through 25, and then just sort of went up from there. And then 55 plus, I'm also going to give them a prefer not to say, right? Now, depending on what population of people you are trying to get an understanding of, you may break down these brackets differently than I did. There's no reason that you should have to copy the exact age brackets that I've created here. Depending on what you're looking at or what age groups you're trying to understand, etc., you might break those down differently for your own survey. Ethnicity, this is the pretty standard compilation of choices that are out there. You might find slightly different worded versions or slightly different variations of this here or there, but this is fairly standard in terms of the ethnicities that are listed. Of course, here you can also provide a other please specified sort of option, and also you could give a prefer not to say, and that's true of all of these options, but also you could eliminate this prefer not to say on all your questions too. It just sort of depends on whether or not you think it's going to be a sensitive issue, depending on the sort of survey that you're giving and the kind of feedback that you're expecting from people. So use your best judgment there. Another is yearly household income. This is sort of to gauge from a class perspective, how people might answer questions based on, again, their sort of financial situation and things like that. Another pretty, going back, much like I said with age, depending on kind of what you're trying to understand, the household income brackets that I've created are a little bit arbitrary here. You could change it. Maybe it's less than 20,000, 20 to 40,000, 40 to 60,000, whatever, So depending, use your best judgment depending on what kind of study you are trying to do and what you are trying to understand. Education level. This is a pretty inclusive education level one that I've created. Some of them just have like less than high school, a bachelor's degree, master's, PhD, whatever. But I try and be more inclusive because some people, for example, go to trade school, which I think it's important to also capture that here. And also some people have like professional degrees, like a JD or a Juris Doctorate or an MD medical doctorate. So these are a little bit different than, say, a PhD philosophy doctorate. So I try and sort of parse those out a little bit. But again, you can kind of look up online to see kind of how people divvy these out and figure out what works best for you. You might also ask about employment status. Employed full-time, 40 plus hours a week, employed part-time, less than 40, blah, blah, blah. Also make sure that you are inclusive here as well. For example, putting in unable to work, because that's a little bit different than unemployed and not looking. Sometimes people are unemployed and not currently looking because they've been employed for so long that they are just they've sort of given up on finding work. It's an unfortunate truth, but based on how things go, sometimes that is a reality for some people. So I would divvy those out because there are some people who, for sometimes physical reasons or disability reasons, etc., may or may not have the ability to work. You also want to make sure you put in like something like self-employed, retired, because again, this would be different too from unable to work or unemployed and currently not working, right? That's sort of a different status, and also student, right? Some people will also ask for marital status. It's again, much of this, like I've sort of repeated ad nauseum, is going to be dependent upon, what your goals are for your survey, right? Whether or not someone is married or not, or whatever, may or may not be relevant to your own study. So just use your best judgment on which demographic questions you will employ. Now, typically demographic questions come at the beginning of a survey. So you'll see that I've sort of even divvied these out. I said demographics, page 1. So I'm going to have a demographics set of questions, and then they will move on in my survey to the next question. And on my page 2, I'm going to have a question that says something like, do you own or have access to a smartphone? Yes or no? Now, you'll notice that I put this on a page of its own. Now, if I'm trying to understand people's smartphone usage and someone answers no, they do not have they do not own, nor do they have access to a smartphone, and they say no, then it really doesn't make sense for me to have them finish the rest of the questions, because they are not going to have, the kind of information that I need for what I'm trying to understand, right? So in this case, I'm putting it on a separate page because I'm going to make this question conditional, right? So if they answer yes, then they will go on to page 3 and answer the rest of the questions I have. If they answer no, I'm going to have them skip to the end of the survey. Now, you can do this with demographics too. Some people do studies where it's like they're trying to understand, something about a certain demographic. So they might say, oh, we're trying to understand smartphone usage among females that are from 16 to 35, right? So you might make your survey up in the demographics page conditional, right? So you might say, if they answer that they are male, other, or prefer not to say, then they do not complete the survey, right? So you'd have the females, anyone who chooses female and anyone who chooses any of these 3 brackets, right, then they would move on to this second question asking about the smartphone. Whereas anybody else who answers either, the male, other, prefer not to say, or any of these older ages, for example, if they answer those questions, you can make it conditional to where they would just jump to the end of your survey, like thanks for answering my questions, even though it might be only like those demographic questions, right? So you can utilize software like Qualtrics in a way that allows you to sort of weed out your primary audience that you want to take your survey. Now, I don't think anybody in this class has any projects that are that specific, where you would be weeding out by demographic. But if you have a project where you think it might be best to do that, chat with me and we can determine whether or not you should take an approach that sort of winnows out certain criteria of people or statuses or whatever to not take the survey or whatnot. So just let me know if you have questions about that. Okay, so, but as you can see here, again, I've sort of arranged my survey on my Word document in a way that I can just sort of follow along and input my questions in a sort of logical progression, and one that I have all my answers ready. So when I'm in Qualtrics, I don't have to be like thinking about, what I still need to add or not add or whatever. I have everything here that I need to add. I just need to basically pull it over. Granted, I'll have to retype this thing or copy and paste certain pieces of this, and that's fine. But I think it's best to sort of lay out my document and have everything sort of organized in such a way. And you'll even see here that I, included like the skip logic in here, right? I want you to skip to the end of the survey if you say you don't have a smartphone here, right? So I'm including skip logic here. I've also added sort of other things here too. Like this one, I'm going to make sure that my question is set up as a Likert scale. Again, we talked about that in class 2, where it has, potentially several questions, and then there are a range of responses. It might be a little confusing on the way that I have this set up in the document, but once we get to Qualtrics and I start showing you how to set up a Likert scale question, this will probably make more sense to you. And then I have the same down here. This is also going to be presented in a Likert scale fashion. And we will input that in that way as well. Okay, so now let's go back over to Qualtrics. My apologies for the slight digression in talking about the Word document, but I really do think it, at least for me, this helps keep me organized and makes my creation of my Qualtrics project more smooth, and it just makes it go by a bit quicker as well. Okay, so I'm gonna name my project. I'm gonna call it smartphone use, and then I'm gonna get started. Okay, so here you can kind of see that I have my title up here. They've already put one question on here for me, and I can start, you can see like things kind of, when I scroll over them, they get highlighted. I can click in there so that way I can edit the text, and that's true of the answer choices as well. You'll see here though that it doesn't look quite like I need it to, right? So my first question over here was, my demographics page. And then, male, female, other, prefer not to say. Of course, I have 4 choices here and only 3 here. So there are ways that we can adjust these things to align with what we need. So here, before I even get to my questions though, I think what I want to do is put in some information for the person who is taking my survey, right? It's always best practice to have some sort of, message to the people that are going to be taking your survey. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click over here and change. You'll see that there's sort of a menu over here on the right side of the screen. And where it says multiple choice, I'm going to click this, and I'm going to put descriptive text instead of like these question types, right? So I'm going to click descriptive text, and you're going to see that it changes over here to where it doesn't have the multiple choice answer anymore. It just has like a place for me to click and add text. So here I'm going to say, thank you for taking the time to take this survey. This survey should take less than 5 minutes for most to complete. And sometimes you can tell them what you're trying to study. For some people, depending on what you're trying to study, you do or don't add this part, but for the most part, it's best practice to try and add, so that way your audience understands, why they're doing what they're doing. So I might say something like, this survey is designed to understand smartphone usage, and I'm just going to sort of leave it at that. Now, if you were doing this for like a real actual study, sometimes there's, not to say that your research project isn't a real actual study, but I'm just saying if you were doing this for something more consequential than your English 203 paper, you might add some additional information here about like how to contact you if they have questions about the survey, or if they have issues with the survey, or things like that. So you might put like your email address on here, or whatever. I'm not requiring you to do that for this, but just know that once you start doing actual studies someday, it might be necessary for you to consider that sort of thing. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to then create a new question. So my first question is going to be gender. Okay. So I'm just going to put, I'm going to form it more as a question. Please choose the gender identity that you, let's see, please choose the gender that you identify, oops, sorry, I can't type, all right, identify as. That was not the most, the best way. See, okay. That was probably not the best way to phrase that question, but it's good enough for now. But you'll see here that there is some logic in this program to the point where it creates some possible choices for you. So here it says male, female, but I want to be a little bit more inclusive than this. So what I'm going to do is over here on the right hand side where it says choices 2, and then it says automatic choices, male, female. I'm going to actually change this, and I'm going to use this plus and minus around the 2. I'm going to add 2 more spaces. So I'm going to have male, female, and here I'm going to put other and colon. And I'm going to use this little button here, this blue button. I'm going to push this little caret, and I'm going to say, let's see, allow text entry. It's the first option here. Now, when I do this, if they click other, then they will be able to specify for me what that other gender expression is, right? So here I'm going to actually add into this other, please specify. Okay. Now, my fourth option was prefer not to say. Okay. So I've got my first question out of the way. Now my next one is age. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back for just 1 second. So for your demographics questions, and even some questions within your survey, you are going to often find that you need to either have someone answer a question or make it optional. For a lot of the questions, you are going to want to force them to respond, okay? So for this, over on the sidebar here, as long as I'm clicked on this question, there is, it says validation options, force response, okay? If I click this little button, then that means they have to answer this question before they can move on to any other pages on my survey, okay? So for most of my demographics questions, I am going to make sure that they are going to, have to give me some sort of response. Now, that's why I think it's important to add like a prefer not to say or things like that, because then even if you're forcing them to answer the question, if it's a question they don't want to answer, they have sort of an out, so to speak. Okay. Okay. So now I'm going to add my other demographics questions. So I'm going to have age, please select your age range. Okay. Now again, I only have 3 options over here, though I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'm going to come over here as long as I have this question selected. I'm going to come over here to this edit multiples, right? So I'm going to click to the plus sign 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. And then I'm going to click in here and just start putting in my my options. I'm actually going to move my window over so I can see a little bit better. I'm going to put under 16 and 16 to 25. Oops. 36. Nope. 26 to 35. 36 to 45. 46 to 55. And 55, or sorry, this is incorrect. It should be 56 plus. So then 56 plus, and prefer not to say. And again, for some of these, if you want to force them to actually give you a response in the bucket, you don't have to necessarily give the prefer not to say. But I always try and, for the most part, give respondees the sort of out, so to speak. Okay, so then you would go on to put in all of these other options. I'm not going to, continue ad nauseum to put these in for the moment for you guys, because you're going to be basically watching me do the same thing that I just did over and over and over, just with different questions. So we're going to pretend that I have input all my page 1 questions, all of these demographic questions, okay, and pretend that I'm ready for page 2. So what I'm going to do then is, after I'm done with that final question, we're going to pretend again that I'm on my marital status question. I'm done with this. So now what I want to do is add a page break. So this is going to mean that all of these demographic questions are on one page, and once they finish these questions, okay, I'm going to force response to that too. Again, you probably want to force response all those. Once they finish these questions, they'll go on to the next page of my survey and see whatever the next question or questions are. So over on the right side of the screen, where we were changing the number of questions, the question type, etc., if you scroll down, you'll have these action buttons on the bottom. I'm going to add page break. So you'll see that once I clicked that, we have this page break displayed here, okay? Now, I'm going to put in my next question, create a new question. My question for page 2 is, do you own or have access to a smartphone? Okay, so I'm going to click in here, do you own or have access to a smartphone? Okay. Now, down here then, I only want a yes/no response, okay? So over here, I'm gonna click yes, and then it included a maybe, but I don't want the maybe here. I just want a 2-answer question. So I'm gonna click it down to 2, and then it resolved to a yes or a no. Now, if for some reason it doesn't auto-populate these answers for you, you can just click in and type the answer or answers in there. Okay. Now, I had told you this is going to be the only question on my page 2, because at this point, I only want people who have or access to or own a smartphone to complete the rest of my survey. Okay. So here, I'm going to make these questions conditional. I'm also going to force response. So let me force response first. I'm clicked on here. So over here, validation options, force response. Now, what I'm going to use, there's display logic and skip logic. Now, add display logic. Display logic means if they answer this question one way or the other, then I'm going to also show them other questions. Now, you could accomplish what I'm about to do using either of these aims, but for today, I'm going to use add skip logic instead. So now that I have this question on here, what I'm going to do is I am going to add a page break. Okay, so now I have this one question between these page breaks, right? So this is the only question they're going to see on that page 2. Okay, now I'm going to create my next question on the next page, which is what do you use your smartphone? What do you use your smartphone for? Choose all that apply. Okay. Now you'll notice that all the questions that they've had to this point are multiple choice, choose one. You can tell that over here when I click on these, you can see that it says single answer. Okay. So now this next one, it says choose all that apply. So once I create this question down here, I'm actually going to change my, the question stats over here to multiple answer. Okay, and you'll see that instead of the round radio button, I now have like a little square that they can check mark. Okay, multiple items. Okay, so I'm going to finish inputting the questions here in just a moment, but I want to return to that skip logic now that I have this page. Okay, so here I'm going to click on this question and I'm going to come down here to add skip logic. Okay. So now you'll see that it's highlighted for yes. So the condition. So if this condition is met, if someone chooses yes, so if yes is selected, they will skip 2, and I want them to go to question 5 at that point. Okay. So here it's already there. Now, depending on when you put in your skip logic and whatever, you may have to come back to this or whatever. Okay. But at this point, they have the logic right already from the jump for me. But double check the logic because depending on where you're at in your survey, how you've put it together, whatever, this auto-populated logic may or may not be correct for you, okay? It is in this point for me, okay, for this survey. Now, the other thing that I want to do, though, is add a skip logic for no. So I'm just going to click add skip logic again. Add skip logic. Now I'm going to click on condition no. So I'm going to toggle this to the no response. Okay. Now notice that it kept the logic up here for yes, right? I'm just adding conditional or an additional condition. So if no is selected, skip 2, and then I'm going to put end of survey. Okay, so anyone who says no, they do not own or have access to a smartphone, they are going to then skip to the end of my survey after they answer this question. Okay, because I'm not going to make them answer all the rest of the questions that have to do with using their smartphone if they don't have one or don't have access to one that they use. Okay, that makes no sense. Okay, so that's my skip logic, right? And I will kind of show you this in action once we get a few more of the questions into our survey here. Okay, so here for this question, we're going to return. So now I'm on page 3. I've added my skip logic to page 2. I'm going to go on to page 3 and continue making my survey. So here I'm going to start copying and pasting some of this because it's quicker. What do you use your smartphone for? Choose all that applies. I'm going to copy. You can right click, or if you're on a Mac, control click. I'm going to copy, or you can Command C if you're on a Mac as well. And I'm going to go ahead and paste in here. Paste. What do you use your smartphone for? You'll notice that it has the bullet point there. I'm just going to eliminate that. It's just like a vestige of coming out of that Word document where I used a bullet point. Okay, so now let me count how many options I have here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so I'm going to come over here like I did last time. And in this question where it says 3 choices, I'm going to just up that into the 10. Okay. And then I'm just going to move this over so I can see and just put them in. I'm going to do social, media. If you hit your tab key on your keyboard, once you're done typing, it will just bring you right to your next thing instead of clicking. It's a quick keyboard shortcut if you'd like. Browsing the web, work, watching film, TV/video. Actually, let's do this because I am strange. Okay, and it's technically correct. Reading news, playing games, taking photos/videos, calls, texting. Okay. So there my, all my choices are in. And then when they go to do this again, they'll be able to choose all that apply for them instead of only choosing one choice. Okay, so I'm now I'm going to put in another question. Create a new question. This next question, how many hours a day do you spend on your smartphone? Now, I'm going to skip putting this one on there just because you're going to develop or create that question much in the same way as these ones up here. You're just going to enter in, you know, the options that you want available to your survey takers. Instead, I'm going to skip to this, how many times per week do you use the following app? Because this one's going to be set up like a Likert question, Likert scale question. Now, what I'm going to do then is over here, I'm going to go to my multiple choice where it says multiple choice right now, and I'm going to change this. Okay, so I'm going to click and it says, let's see. Now, Likert scale, what you're going to use, it's called a matrix table. And it gives you an, if you look over to the left side of your screen, as I'm scrolling through these, it gives a sort of example of what some of those things might look like. A matrix table looks approximately like this, but you can change around how many options there are, both horizontally and vertically. Okay, so I'm going to say matrix table. And see, it gives me some of my options right here. Okay, so right now there are 3 points across, there are 3 statements down, but I'm going to change that. So here I have a list of the apps. That's going to be what I'm going to put in this section here, the statements. Instead, I'm going to put my apps there. And then on the table on the top, I'm going to use the number of times per week. So I'm going to enter my question first, which is how many times per week do you use the following apps? So I'm going to click in here. How many times per week do you use the following apps? Okay, so I'm going to move this back over, and I have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 options that I need going across the top. Okay, so over here, let's see, that's the scale points, the top version here. See how it says click to write scale point 1. So over here where it says scale points, it's at 3, but I'm going to increase that to 8. Okay. And now I'm going to just click in here, 0, and then I can tab over 1 to 3, tab 3 to 6, tab 6 to 9, 9 to 12, and 12 to 15, 15 to 18, and 18 plus. Now, much like the other things that I said before, the way that I have these grouped, you know, the 1 to 3, 3 to 6, whatever, again, depending on what you're measuring and the kind of questions you're asking, whatever, you know, you might scale that differently. Again, this is a survey that is not going to apply to the projects that most of you are doing, but, you know, it at least gives you kind of an idea of how to put the survey itself together. Okay, so for the statements here, let me count how many I need. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, so over here, where it says statements 3, I'm going to increase that to 11. Okay, so now I have all these statements that I can put in. I'm going to go over. Okay, so I'm going to do Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Snapchat, WhatsApp, I think I might have spelled that wrong, but I'm not sure, Pinterest, Instagram, YouTube, Netflix, Hulu, Prime Okay. So I'm going to force response on this question as well. You can force response. So over here, validation options, force response. So people will then tell me how often per week they use these. So they'll be able to choose one option per line. Okay, so I might say Facebook, I use that 3 to 6 times a week. Twitter, I use that 6 to 9 times a week, etc. So your respondents can sort of choose for each of these the occurrence of each, occurrence of uses for each, if that makes sense. Okay. Cool. So that's how a Likert option works. Now, we also said that more typical Likert response is something like, for each of the following statements, please choose the answer, example, never, rarely, usually, always, that aligns most with your habits. Like this is more of a traditional Likert scale use. So let's go ahead and put that in as well. So I'm going to create a new question. And over here, I'm going to go to multiple, where it says multiple choice now. I'm going to click this so I can change it again to the matrix table. Okay. And I'm going to adjust my question types, or I'm sorry, the scale points and the statements, the number of them available. So for the scale at the top, I want 1, 2, 3, 4 options. So never, rarely, usually, always. Okay. So I'm going to go up to my scale. Let's see, 4. So I can see now that I have 4. So I'm going to say never, oops, and what else did I have? Sorry, never, rarely, usually, always. Rarely, usually, always. Oh, I see what I did wrong. Okay, for whatever reason, I have a 5-point scale. I don't want that. I want 4. My apologies. So never, rarely, usually, always. Okay, so then over here, I have 3 statements, but what I really need are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'm going to adjust over here on my sidebar so that way I can have my 7 statements. And then I will start to add the text for those. Now here, they are more like statements, right? You'll see that I've actually set them up as statements. I check my smartphone first thing when I get up in the morning. Okay. I check, or excuse me, I bring my smartphone into the restroom with me. Okay, so I'm not going to finish putting all of these in because, again, this video is already going to be super long for you guys, but a necessary tutorial. But then you continue putting in your statements, and then also on this question, I'm going to force response over on my sidebar here, force response. So that way when people take my survey, they have to answer this question before they can move on. And you'll see here then people can then say, I check my smartphone first thing when I get up in the morning. They can reply never, rarely, usually, always, right? So they can kind of give you a sense of that. Now, I will say some people create multiple Likert scales like I did here, but use similar top options, right? Your scale. Make sure that if you divvy out your scale, so like sometimes they'll ask a certain set of questions, like maybe I would ask this set of questions about a smartphone, but maybe I'm also asking about the use of a tablet or something. And maybe I'm breaking out that question with breaking out basically this same set of responses, but in relation to a tablet later on in my survey. If I do that though, make sure that if you have a similar set of options at the top, that you align your options in the same direction. So if I did basically this same setup, but in relation to say like a tablet, like I said, for later on in my survey. I will not want to swap the answer choices. So maybe like do always, usually, rarely, never, right? Don't flip don't flip them. The reason for this is people are creatures of habit even when they are taking surveys. Just to sort of give an explanation of why I think this. When I was working somewhere on the college campus in an office capacity years ago, my office administrator was giving people surveys, and the survey had a couple of different sections of Likert questions. And what we found was people were saying, oh, they had such a great experience. They rated their professor really, 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 really high. But then in the program section, they were all of their answers aligned with the other side, which was a negative. And we couldn't understand why they were doing this. And what we found was when we checked with the person who took the survey, because it was like a program evaluation, so it was not anonymous in the way that your surveys should be. What we found was we had flipped the answers so that the negatives were on the left on the first set of questions, and then the scale built up to the positive, whereas on the other, the positive side was on the left and the negative responses were built upon to the right. So what they did was they assumed that our scales were the same way. So they thought they were giving us all positive responses, but because of the way that we created the survey, the way that we flipped the scale to be positive to negative on one set of questions, and then negative to positive on the other, there was an assumption made by our survey taker that invalidated their responses as a result of our poor survey design. So that is something to keep in mind as you are doing something like this. Now, the same sort of applies if you have a set of questions, for example, that are a little bit different than this, but maybe still have sort of a never or negative sort of connotation to an always or positive kind of connotation. So even if you set up your question, to something like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate each of your apps, for example? Like if we wanted them to rate these, right? So here we have sort of a negative or negative correlation here. So we would probably put our negative responses for that other Likert question left aligned to moving to a more positive aligned always, right? So keep those sorts of things in mind as you create your surveys, because they can have an impact on the way that people answer your questions, and you don't want to invalidate answers because of poor design, okay? So going back to the creation of the survey itself, here that's technically the last question I have, so we're going to go ahead and just end there basically. But for the end of survey, you'll see this blue bar. You can click and do survey termination options, okay? Now you can do quite a bit here. I wouldn't touch too much. One of the things that I will usually do is, let's see, here in the survey termination section here, I will do a show response summary. Basically what this means is at the end of the survey, after someone takes your survey, they will be able to see a review of the responses that they gave you. Depending on what kind of study you're doing and things like that, you might not want people to have access to your questions after they end their survey. In this context, I think it's probably fine because it's just for English 203. But keep in mind, this is something that you'll want to keep in the forefront of your mind if you create a survey for, say, a lab that you're working on campus, or something like that, right? Check with whoever you're working with to see if they want people to be able to see their responses at the end. In lieu of that, you could always do a default end of survey message, or even create a custom one if you want. But here I'm just going to recommend that you do show response summary so people can see, what answers they gave you. Okay. Up here, survey protection. A lot of this is going to be, if you're doing more large scale studies or things like that, sometimes you'll have, by invitation only type of things where you only want specific people to take your survey. So you might even password protect it so that way only people who have access to your link and also have the password to take the survey will be the ones taking it, rather than this open access where anyone who has the link can take it, right? So there are different options in terms of creating your survey, protecting who can and can't take it, protecting what they can and can't see, etc. Here, we don't need anything that intensive, right? But again, depending on if you work in a lab or do, more serious and more consequential studies in the future and use this survey software, these are options that you may need to consider when you're creating, okay? So now that I've clicked show response summaries, I've changed that up. I'm just gonna hit save. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna preview the survey to kind of give you guys a look at what this looks like in action. So what it does, it gives you a side-by-side preview. On the left here, this is what it will look like as they're going through the survey on a desktop. And then it also gives you a mobile look as well. Okay, so you can see here, there's my demographic questions. Obviously, it'd be a little longer if I had taken the time to input every single one of the questions. So I'm going to just go through and do the sample stuff here. I'm going to say, what are you, female? Please select your age group, 26 to 35, etc. So I'm going to pretend like I answered all those questions. No, actually, I'm going to unselect this. Or actually, I don't think it's going to let me. Actually, let me restart. So if I go to, let's say I say female, and I don't answer this question, even though it's forced response. If I click down here to try and move on in the survey, it's going to give me an error. And it's because you put that they need to respond, okay? That's why you use that force response button. So they can't skip a question that you need an answer to, okay? So now I'm gonna click this, and once I've resolved that issue, it will let me move on, okay? So now here, do you own or have access to a smartphone? I'm gonna click yes, and hopefully, if I set this up correctly, and I think I did, it should bring me then to the next question, or the next page of questions, right? So then, what do you use your smartphone for? Choose all that apply. Here I can click, social media, watching TV films, work, taking photos, texting, okay, or whatever the case may be. Here I can also let them know how many times I do things, right? And it'll only allow me to choose one per. If I try and click more, it'll just move my indicator. Okay, so I'm going to go through. I'm just going to randomly assign things. These are not actually my usage at all, actually. And then I'm going to do the same down here. I'm just going to sort of do this so that way you guys can see what the end of survey looks like. So here we're going to pretend like I completed my survey. I'm going to click this red button to complete it. And then it's going to give me, again, a summary of responses. Okay, so that way I can see what it is that I provided. Your respondees will also have an opportunity to download a copy of this, which is their responses. Okay, and this is based on the fact that I had them show them the survey responses at the end, that last thing that we did prior to testing the survey. Okay, now I'm going to restart the survey one more time, and the reason I'm doing this is because I want to make sure that all of my fail safes are in place. So for this one, I already checked, here, once I did this, it didn't let me move on, but let's make sure that it also doesn't let me move on if I don't do this one, right? So it's gonna give me that thing, so I'm gonna just choose something. Okay, so now this one, let's double check and make sure that the survey worked for the logic in this question as well. So if I choose no, what it should do is send me to the end of the survey because I don't have a smartphone. So let's make sure that that's true. Yep, so it just brought me to the end of the survey, okay? And because of that, it only gives them the responses that they provided answers for, or shows them the questions that they responded to. It does not show the questions that they did not provide answers for, okay? So that's kind of how that works. You always want to make sure that you go through and do several test runs of your survey before you make it go live. just to make sure that it's, the flow of the survey is correct, particularly if you have several instances where you use question logic. You want to make sure that your forced responses are working, that if they skip something, that it's not going to let them move on without answering those questions, etc. That being said, make sure that you are keeping in mind the fact that your test responses tend to also be in your survey data. So I'd make sure you do your test responses maybe a day before you plan to send it out, so that way you can eliminate all the data from your date of test runs easily and not accidentally delete any of your real data. And I'll show you and talk about how to go about some of that later in a future tutorial. Okay, so the next thing to do once you have your survey done, you've double checked to make sure that your logic and everything is working. The next thing you want to do is publish. Okay. Now it's going to give you this scale, unless you're like way over here in the red zone or something. It's probably fine, but it might give you a couple of, recommendations. You can view the recommendations if you want, but if you've followed kind of what I've laid out here, it's probably going to be somewhere in the yellow to green zone, which means I would just say you're probably good to go, particularly if you already checked through your responses to make sure your logic is working and all of that. So here I'm going to push publish. And it says survey activated. And now I have a link. This link right here is what I will copy and then paste and send out to people to take my survey. A lot of people put this on social media, or I know a lot of people have created groups here on campus for their students to share their survey links, so that way students can take each other's surveys and help each other out. Because of course, a lot of you in this class are probably well aware that other students are doing similar types of projects as you are right now in English 203 classes across campus. So, or remotely now, but you get the idea. So it's always good if you guys can help each other out and take each other's surveys. Most of them are relatively short. So, pick a handful or two of surveys from other 203 students from our class, or even, across, our campus, and, help them out, do surveys for them, so that way they can have data for their projects, and hopefully others will, meet you in kind and also perform your survey for you. Okay. But again, make sure you copy and paste this, and then I'm going to close, copy and then paste it somewhere useful, right? So I might do it like at the bottom of my, document where my questions are or whatever. So I have access, easy access to that again. If for some reason you need it though, you can, let me exit out or go to NIU again. So I'm going to go niu.edu. I'm going to go quick links. I'm going to go back to Qualtrics. I'm going to find in my list here for you guys, for most of you, it's probably going to be the very first thing you've done. Now you'll see here the 2 responses. Those are my test responses. So that's why I was saying you're going to want to make sure that you delete those test results before you, look into your survey data. But again, I'll teach you guys how to do that later. And it says active. So it means I'm currently collecting survey responses. Now, if for some reason I need to access my survey again, what I can do is I'm going to click on the name of this. I'm going to go to actions, I believe it is. Let me double check that that's accurate. Nope, it's not. Distributions, maybe. Sorry, yeah, there we go. Sorry, I knew it was one of those 2. Distributions. And then I'm just going to find this anonymous link again, and it should be the same link as before, right? So you do have access to it later if you need it, okay? All right, so I hope you found this useful. I apologize. I know it's like an hour-long video. If you're watching on YouTube, maybe you've sped it up to 2 times the speed and heard me talk like a maniac fast, which is probably what I would do. But I do think this is important for you guys to know how to do this. This is how most people in English 203s who are doing surveys are conducting the surveys. Obviously, there's also the option of doing it in person and on paper in most circumstances. Of course, right now, hopefully you all are self-isolating, as the Centers for Disease Control have told us that we should be doing, and we'll hopefully rely then on people doing your survey online using something like Qualtrics. Now, granted, some of you might also have access to something like Google Forms, I think they're called, or SurveyMonkey, or other similar online platforms to do survey taking. If you are more comfortable using something like that, so long as you're able to pull your data and add the kinds of questions you need to add, things like that, then, more power to you. You are certainly welcome to do that. The thing with Qualtrics, it's probably good for you to learn how to use it, because it is a more professional and more widely used and accepted platform for people who are doing survey work that is more sensitive in nature or requires more robust sets of or kinds of questions, more robust ability to work with data and things like that. So it's probably smart for you to learn how to use Qualtrics, but it would be fine for your English 203 project, for those of you who are doing a survey, to do, SurveyMonkey or, Google. I think, like I said, I think it's Google Forms, I believe, or whatever works for you. That's fine. Okay. If you have questions about this, feel free to send me an email, and I'll be happy to respond ASAP. I hope you all are staying self-isolated and staying safe and keeping others safe as well by doing so. I know this is going to be a little bit of a strange rest of the semester, considering we are going from face-to-face to now doing everything online, but I think it is important that we do our part to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 and keep ourselves and all of our loved ones, particularly those who are older or immunocompromised, safe from the horrendous effects of COVID-19 and those who have bad experiences with it. Obviously, most of my students are young, and I anticipate that you are going to, even if you do get COVID-19, most of you are going to be fine. But, there are probably people in our class that are immunocompromised that may not do so well with it. So I think it's important that we're doing our role to, again, mitigate the spread, because it can be just really awful for those who, are immunocompromised and such. So anyways, I will stop waxing poetic about the pandemic and allow you all to get back to your lives. Thank you for watching, and I do hope that this is helpful to you. Again, just let me know if you have questions, and we'll go from there. I'll have more video tutorials and things like that up for you semi-soon, and we will, we'll work at things as we need to. And we'll kind of, we'll figure things out as we go. Okay. So stay safe. I'll talk to you all soon, and I will sign off now.